Hello, this is Jay Callahan again. Welcome back. Today we're going to talk about another aspect of crisis that we really haven't talked about before, which is the idea of the self-limiting nature of crisis, and then also the idea that although most people who experience a crisis, once they get through it, end up at roughly the same level of functioning, in some other instances, less often, people end up either at a lower level of functioning or a higher level of functioning. So I'm going to talk about this a little bit and start out with the sadder case where a client ended up at a lower level of functioning. I'm going to build on an idea that I mentioned to you if you watched my introductory lecture, self-description, and that is the work I've done before with survivors of suicide. As you recall, when I was at the University of Michigan, I originated a program in Ann Arbor for people who have had people in their family die of suicide, which is referred to as survivors of suicide. Now, survivors of suicide sounds like someone who's attempted suicide but survived, but it really means the family survivors of people who have died from suicide. So the first issue is about how crises end spontaneously, that they're self-limiting. We've talked already about how crises last from 3 days to about 6 weeks, but why not longer? Why can't a crisis go on indefinitely? Or sometimes we think we know of clients who seem to be in a crisis, all the time. Well, the answer is basically that crises are self-limiting because people can't maintain that level of intensity. Just physiologically and physically, a crisis is very intense, and after a period of time, and we think that maximum is about 6 weeks, then the crisis will spontaneously come to an end. It may be in some cases, in many cases, that people are able to resolve. I hesitate to use the word resolve exactly, but people are able to end the crisis through their own efforts or through professional help or through help of their family and friends. But in other cases, people are not able to come to grips with the event that happened and the meaning of the event that happened, and the crisis continues. But as I said, it spontaneously comes to an end because we just can't maintain that level of anxiety, angst, depression, agitation, that level of energy for a long period of time. So sometimes when that crisis comes to an end, the client ends up at lower level of functioning, and that's what this case we're going to talk about here is about. And the other idea that is when a person does end up at that lower level of functioning after a traumatic event, often you can properly label that new stability as, unfortunately, a new disorder. Post-traumatic stress disorder, most frequently, could also be major depression, could also be substance abuse or alcoholism. It's whatever it is. But the point is, when a person enters a new level of stability at a lower level, often there is some psychopathology that's a part of that's still affecting them from the crisis. So just to help you visualize that, I want to show you a picture of a schematic of a crisis. And let me jump ahead. Okay, here's the picture. So you can see in the upper left, the major line here refers to the level of functioning of a given person. So you can see up here in the upper left, they're coming along at a stable, this horizontal line, stable level of functioning, and then that small downward arrow is when the stressful event happens, the triggering event. And then the person goes down into this curve, down lower and lower functioning, less and less able to cope with things. At some point they kind of bottom out, and then eventually they come back up, and then either they're able to resolve the crisis, again, as I said, on their own or with help, or they're not able to resolve it and they end up in one of these three ways. And you can see the three arrows in the upper right, either a lower level of functioning, an equal level of functioning, or a higher level of functioning. And as you can see by the scale at the bottom, that this whole process takes anywhere, as I've been saying, anywhere from 3 days to 6 weeks. So let me go back to the previous slide, which you'll be able to look at if you want and see if I covered everything. Yeah, pretty much. So here's that picture again. Now we can also add on to that and say, how about when a person has an emergency? If you recall, I already talked about how mental health emergencies very frequently happen in the context of a crisis. So, a person loses their job and they make a suicide attempt in the crisis that follows the job loss. In this diagram I'm going to show you in a minute, there's a suicide attempt early on and then a violent outburst later on. Okay, so you can see it's the same curve, but early on we have the suicide attempt, which I've illustrated as a downward spike. Like, I don't know if it's an even lower level of functioning or what. I'm not quite sure how to illustrate that, but the spike downward is the best I can do. And then over on the right side, this same individual, still in crisis, maybe even getting better, but still in crisis, has a violent outburst. That is, he goes postal, as we talked about before, and has a violent outburst at the people he perceived as being responsible for his job loss. Again, the time frame is 3 days to 6 weeks, and again we have the 3 different possible outcomes. Okay, so now what about this poor outcome, where the individual ends up at a lower level of functioning? This is represented by the arrow on the right, the lowest arrow on the right. So to illustrate that, I want to briefly talk about the case of Marilyn. So I met Marilyn when I was the co-leader of a survivors of suicide group here in Chicago. As I mentioned, I began a whole program of support groups in Ann Arbor. And then when I moved to Chicago, which was in the early 90s, for a while I volunteered at Catholic Charities as a co-leader of the survivors of suicide groups that they operate. They have a program called LOSS, Loving Outreach to Survivors of Suicide, and they run at any given time often a half dozen different groups all around the Chicagoland area, different geographic areas, so people don't have to travel very far. Marilyn was a member of that group, and that was because of the suicide of her adult daughter. So previously, Marilyn, although she was originally from Illinois, had taken a job for some years as the CEO of a small nonprofit organization in Washington that did some business with the government and had some lobbying aspects. I'm not sure of all the details. And it was a small organization, but she was the CEO, which is this is a very high-functioning job and a high-functioning person we're talking about. Her 3 adult children, still lived in northern Illinois. I can't remember now, this has been some years ago, this has been 20 years ago, what was the story, whether she was widowed or divorced, or that her husband was not in the picture. She was called by family back to Illinois because her 32-year-old daughter made a suicide attempt. Her daughter was married and had 2 small kids, and from what we learned later, fell into an episode of major depression. The details about that are not very clear, but she became very depressed, and on a particular day tried to kill herself by asphyxiating herself in the garage in her home in the car. And she was actually partway through that suicide attempt when her 2 little kids came looking for her. Where's mommy? Where's mommy? And they find her in the garage with the car running. And which I guess you could take from that a measure of how depressed she was, that she would actually make a suicide attempt with her children in the house. She came back to Chicago, or to northern Illinois where they lived, and met with her daughter very quickly, within a day, and also her adult son and her other adult daughter, and the original daughter's husband and everything. And the family took her to a private psychiatrist who met with her and evaluated her as high risk for suicide, kind of obvious, and then she was and also as having major depression, and arranged for her to be hospitalized at a suburban hospital in the Chicago area. I don't know which one. This happened years ago, before I was even aware of what some of the hospitals are around her. So she was hospitalized and initially put on suicide watch, appropriately. But after a few days, and really only a few days, I can't remember now, maybe 5 days, let's say, or something like that, she was given a grounds pass, which meant she was then free to leave the inpatient unit. And it was summertime, and the hospital had multiple buildings and grounds with grass and trees where people could go outside and, sit on park benches and enjoy the weather. For whatever reason, apparently they felt she was no longer at risk for suicide. She was given a grounds pass, which meant she could go outside without any staff member accompanying her. And unfortunately, she killed herself. She walked away from the hospital. She walked out down the road to a subdivision in the suburbs. She walked around until she came upon a house with the garage door open and saw that there was a gasoline can for the lawnmower in the garage, and she went in the garage, she dumped the gasoline on herself and set herself on fire and died. Obviously a tragic situation. As you can imagine, Marilyn was devastated. Most people would be. As I have mentioned, as I'll be talking again, it's often amazing how resilient people can be. That many people experience extreme traumatic events and are resilient, do not develop symptoms or reactions, the trauma symptoms we talked about. But many do, and I'd have to say, I think this is one that would be really difficult for almost anybody. Obviously, when I ran my Survivors of Suicide group for a number of years in Ann Arbor, I saw a lot of people like this. But they are, if you stop and think about it, they are self-referred. So there certainly may well be other people who have suicides in their family and who cope with them okay, and who don't come to a support group such as this. In any case, Marilyn was devastated, and she quit her job. She never went back to D.C., not even to pick up her stuff. Her adult son rented a truck and drove down to D.C. and packed up her apartment and drove back. She got an apartment in northern Illinois and struggled. She was in individual therapy. She was taking medication. She was in our Survivors of Suicide group, and she continued to struggle. Eventually, she got a job, and it was a kind of ordinary, routine office job as far as I knew. I didn't know too many details, but it really sounded like this job was like 5 levels below the level of skill and sophistication and savvy that it would take to do her previous job. But this is all she could do. Okay, this is all she could do, given the trauma of her daughter's death. And so this is a very good example, unfortunately, of someone who came out of a crisis eventually and settled into a new level of functioning. And unfortunately, this new level was quite a bit below her previous level of functioning. And we could correctly label her new level of functioning both PTSD and major depression. All right, so one other thing just to keep in mind, that as I alluded to a minute ago, suicide is a tremendous trauma for family members. Some people deal with it well. Many people, in my experience, are devastated by it, and it becomes very difficult to recover from this kind of event. Okay, so that's our unfortunate case of crisis to lower level of functioning, and in the next video I'll be presenting a case of crisis to higher level of functioning. So I'll see you next time.